Hi, I'm Andrea. Welcome to today's Harper Lecture. The Harper Lecture series highlights the University of Chicago's collective commitment to the highest aspirations and standards in research and education. Today, you will hear from our world-class faculty and enjoy stimulating conversations on critical topics, all in the comfort of your home.
We extend our appreciation in advance to our global university community for their collective efforts in supporting the mission of the university in today's deeply challenging environment. Technology has allowed us to remain connected and engaged, and tonight, you too will be part of the conversations. A couple of notes. All participants will be muted. However, we do encourage you to ask questions. We will have plenty of time for questions at the end of the presentation. If you have issues with audio, you may want to shut down your programs running in the background or dial in from your phone.
Hi, I'm Colin. On behalf of everyone at the UChicago Alumni Office, we offer our deepest gratitude and appreciation for your continued support. We're proud to be part of this community as it has come together during these trying times to invest in our students, empower our faculty and scientists, and extend care and connection. And now it's my pleasure to welcome you to the 41st season of the University of Chicago's Harper Lecture Series. Thank you for being with us. Enjoy.
Welcome to today's Harper Lecture, an Election 2020 debrief with Will Howell and faculty from the Division of the Social Sciences. I'm Amanda Woodward. I'm the Dean of the Division of the Social Sciences, and I'm really delighted to welcome you all to this evening's event. Tonight, we have the pleasure of joining you from the newly completed David Rubenstein Forum, which is located just across the Midway from Rockefeller Chapel in Chicago's Hyde Park campus. This building is a physical expression of the university's academic character. It's a space for convening, a space for intellectual engagement and the pursuit of knowledge and understanding. It's designed as a space to foster inquiry, open exchange, and the power of interdisciplinary convening. In short, it's really the perfect venue for this evening's event. I want to thank the Alumni Relations and Development Office for inviting us to be in this event this evening and to join the alumni community. And on behalf of everybody in the Social Sciences Division and UChicago alumni and the UChicago Alumni Relations, I want to thank you all for joining us this evening. I know you have a lot of demands on your attention at the moment. It's my pleasure to introduce our faculty group to you. Our moderator is Will Howell, the Sidney Stein Professor in the University of Chicago Harris School of Public Policy and in the Department of Political Science. Will is the chair of the Political Science Department, and he's also the director of the Center for Effective Governance. He's written widely on separation of powers, issues of American political institutions, and especially the presidency. He's currently working on research projects on Obama's education policies, distributive policies, and the normative foundations of executive power. Now let me introduce you to each of our panelists. Elisabeth Clemens is the William Rainey Harper Distinguished Service Professor of Sociology and the college. She's also an alumna of the university with PhD from the Department of Sociology. Liz works on issues that explore the role of social movements and organizational innovation and political change. Jane Dailey is Associate Professor of American History and in the law school and the college. Her interests include modern United States social and political history, African American history, the American South, human rights, and legal history. Marco Garrido is Assistant Professor in the Department of Sociology. Marco's work is international in scope, with a focus on the Philippines and Southeast Asia. He studies the ways in which rich and poor people live together in cities and how spatial arrangements of urban life influence political attitudes and political movements. John Mark Hansen is the Charles L. Hutchinson Distinguished Service Professor of Political Science and the college. He's also a prior dean of the Social Sciences Division. He's one of the nation's leading scholars of American politics. His research is focused on interest groups, citizen activism, and public opinion. And finally, Kaushik Rajan is professor of anthropology in the college, and he is co-director of the Chicago Center for Contemporary Theory. His work lies at the intersection of anthropology and science and technology studies, with commitments to social theories of capitalism and post-colonial studies. Much of his work is focused on India and relations between India and the US, and his newest work is in South Africa. Colleagues, thank you for joining us. The floor is yours.
Terrific. Thanks, Dean Woodward. What a pleasure for us to get together. And to get together in a time, well, it's a time of anxiety and polarization and upset. I'll say I'm really grateful to first be in this beautiful building. This is the first time I've been in it, I think, for everybody here. It's just stunning. And to be in conversation with such a terrific group of colleagues across the social sciences. We've got people from history and sociology and political science and anthropology. I'm grateful to be out of my room and to be properly dressed and to stop refreshing, what are the returns over and over again, and to have a little bit of a break from that. Let me say, just from the outset, what the returns are, just to serve as a timestamp for the conversation that we're about to have, which is that it's neck and neck in Georgia right now. There's about a 4,000 vote difference between those who have broken for Trump versus Biden. In Pennsylvania, it's at about a 65,000 vote difference in favor of Trump. In Nevada, and it's about 11,000, and in Arizona, it's about 67,000, I believe. And those are the four key states to watch. And right now, it looks like Biden has an edge. But we're getting together today not to make predictions about how it's likely to break out or to offer an answer about where this is all going. Rather, we're gathering to ask questions about meaning and about the enduring significance of this moment, this election, these campaigns. And it's in that spirit that I think we're going to try to grapple with what's before us. And it's a conversation that I'm hoping we can engage in three parts. The first part, I will present a question that everybody's going to answer, and we'll have about 2 minutes for each person. And then I'm going to offer a particular question directed to one of our panelists, who will then offer an answer, and then we'll discuss as a group what we see on the particular topic at hand. And then the third part, we're going to open it up and take the questions from the audience, and we'll grapple with them as a group. So there we go. We're off and running. The first act. We talk about an election or a campaign, but there isn't an election or a campaign. What constitute elections and campaigns are actually lots of events and trends and themes and moments. There's a collection of them. And over the course of our conversation, we'll try to make sense of the whole. But to get us started, I thought what we could do is if each of you would identify a single thing. It could be a theme, it could be a moment that is of enduring significance in your evaluation for the work that you do or the field that you occupy. What will people 5, 10 years hence be wanting to grapple with or make sense of when they look back on the 2020 election? If you could sort of tease out one. I'm sure you have several in mind, but you got to pick one. Mark, why don't you get us started, and then we'll just go right down the line.
Well, I, of course, am a political scientist and I study elections, and so one of the things I'm often quite concerned about is what the outcome of elections are and trying to understand the dynamics that lead to the outcomes of elections. We've been seeing over the last 25 years, elections becoming increasingly closer and more intensely competed for. I think we sort of understand what lies behind all of that. It goes under the name of polarization. But what I don't think that we understand very well as political scientists yet, and that I think we will be trying to understand better, is why is partisanship so intensely held these days? What has happened in our politics so that you had so many people this year talking about this election as the most important election of my lifetime? I mean, on both the right and the left, you heard people make that statement. People believing increasingly, and we have public opinion data behind this, that the people who believe, or the people who identify with the other party are not just wrong, or wrong in their policy views, or incorrect in what they think is best for this country, but they're stupid, or they're dishonest, or they're un-American, for that matter. And what it is led us to a turn where we seem to think that all political conflict is zero-sum. That my winning means that you have to lose, and if you win, then I lose. And that's very, very different. So somehow or other, partisanship, which would seem to be a kind of minor identity that people would have. After all, there are many more primary identities than partisanship, things like, race and gender and where you're from and so forth. But it seems to have it seemed to have come to have had a centrality in our society that I think is really quite puzzling. And I think that that's the kind of thing we'll be trying to figure out as the years go by.
Terrific. Liz.
On a panel like this in 2016, I did a foolish thing and I ventured a prediction, which I thought was so obvious that it was a slam dunk, which was that in 2020, there would be a fierce competition for the nomination for the presidency on the Libertarian ticket. I expected from 2016 to see a repeat of the third parties, the schisms, and the surprise is that in this election there has been relatively little of that, and the divisions have been expressed through the major parties to a really quite extraordinary degree. Now that can produce sort of two kinds of questions for future scholars. One set takes you into the weeds of how did the nomination processes in these third parties that have automatic ballot access, how did that work? How did the major parties seem to contain defections, which is, I think, going to be a really interesting question. Why did no billionaire buy a third-party nomination? A real puzzle to me, given that very wealthy individuals did a lot of things. The other set of questions, though, comes when you flip figure and ground, and it really takes me to the same place that Mark just laid out in slightly different terms, which is thinking about how partisanship has become such a powerful organizing identity and interest in American life. There are lots of different identities and interests, as Mark laid out, and the research has shown, particularly focusing on exogamy or marrying outside of your group, that a lot of these have become less important over time. There's more marriage and more approval of marriage outside of one's racial group, outside of one's religious group. But at the same time, recent research is showing that partisan identity turns out to shape the way people react to online profiles on dating sites. It shapes hiring decisions when CVs are made up to go out to human resources people. And more identities and interests are getting hooked into partisanship. And that's going to require us to think about political participation, not as something that reflects social and economic positions and attributes that we bring to the party system, but which is actually shaped by the party system in combination with the media. So politics is making itself in a powerful zero-sum way.
Thank you, Liz. Jane, you're up.
Yeah, well, thank you. Really happy to be here. It's nice to see you.
Yeah.
So I have actually published a sort of big history of the United States, a textbook kind of book. So, I do have to keep my eye open for what are the things and how many words would it take to describe them. And I'm really surprised this year by the turnout. I don't know if other people saw that coming, but my colleague Mark Hansen tells me we have about 150 million people projected to have voted, which the AP says is about 68% of the voting of the electorate, and that's enormously higher than it has been. And it's it's striking. It hasn't been this high since 1896. Americans have not gone to the polls in numbers like they did this year. There have been other years, 1960, 1980, that also came up. But these numbers are really astonishing. And it'll be interesting to figure out the role of the pandemic in this, because I think a lot of people are saying, oh my God, in the midst of a pandemic, people are trekking to the polls. But in fact, 2/3 of these ballots were sent already, that the pandemic meant that more people stayed at home and voted. And those numbers were then just not exaggerated, but leapt up. And it was easier for a lot of people to vote this time than it's ever been before. And I think that matters when we look at the numbers that we get when people don't have to take time off from work to go to work, or brave a long line, or brave the weather, but can vote from the comfort of their own home and have reasonable confidence that the post office will deliver it on time. I was surprised by that, and I'm also, because I'm an optimist mostly, kind of touched that even in the midst of this horrible partisanship and just ugliness, people believed in the process. And even with the head of the post office really doing his best to try and mess things up, people still voted, and they did the one thing that you can do as a citizen to participate. And I was thinking about Oliver Wendell Holmes earlier in the day, because like many of the Civil War generation, Holmes was very concerned that people had to participate in the process of voting, and that the most important thing in participating is you have to believe that even if you lose, you might win next time. So that you can't believe that the system is completely rigged against you. And if you believe that the system is rigged against you, then you won't participate and you'll have some other kind of politics. And so I was kind of amused earlier today when even President Trump seemed like he'd sort of inadvertently expressed this norm when he said, well, maybe I'll run in 2024. Already that he was looking forward to the next election, which again, for someone who'd said, I won't abide by the outcome of this election, that was very disturbing. But to hear him musing already, well, there's always 2024,
When he'll be Biden's age.
That's right. That's right. So there'll be a precedent for him. That's right. We'll move into our octogenarian presidents from our.
Marco.
I study democracy in the Philippines, and so I've been thinking about what's been unfolding, not just with the election, but over the last 4 years, with an eye to how people in other parts of the world are seeing it. And I've really been struck by the damage the Trump administration has done to the cause of democracy around the world. It's really undermined the United States as a symbol of liberal democracy. And you have to understand how important that symbol is, or perhaps used to be, especially to people in what used to be called new democracies, but by now they're 30 years in, 30 to 40 years in. Now these democracies, Philippine democracy specifically, which I study, has been marked for so long by extreme instability, largely due to political events, everything from coup attempts to impeachment trials, to massive protests that replace one president with another. And there was a sense that, well, this is us, but we're going to get there, and that there was the United States. And so the United States for a long time served as a picture of what politics was supposed to look like. In fact, compared to the instability and the excitement, frankly, of Philippine politics, US politics seemed downright boring for a long time. People would look at it and they say, well, of course it's going to work out this way. This is the picture of strong institutions at work. Mm-hmm. Now, this picture was idealized. It always has been, but the Trump administration really drew back the veil. And I think people look at Trump's actions, some of the actions that Jane mentioned, aspersing the integrity of the election, mixing family and business, all these kinds of things. And it's not that these things were new to them. They've seen it. It reminds them of Mel DeMarco's Trump's vanity, or the corruption of this guy. They've seen it before. What was different this time was that this was an American president doing it. And I think there was a kind of epiphany that accumulated over the 4 years that the line between strong and weak institutions is really paper thin. Mm-hmm. And I think that kind of fragility really informs the political situation in the Philippines in a big way. And also the ease with which he was able to do the things that he did with relative impunity. Some people cheered, some people complained. Most people just looked on mouths agape. I think this really struck people that this used to be where we were headed. But now, I think there's a reckoning with that kind of model and frankly, a kind of shifting in the imagination of what the future of democracy is supposed to look like.
Thank you. Thank you. Kaushik.
Yeah, thanks, Will. It's a real privilege for me to be a part of this conversation, and especially because this isn't something that I work on. I'm an election geek, but I don't work on elections. I don't work on American politics. So I'm coming at this from three perspectives. The first as an anthropologist. The second as, since we're speaking of partisanship, as a partisan democratic voter. And third as a relatively newly minted American citizen who only acquired citizenship after Trump was elected because it didn't feel safe to be even a relatively privileged non-citizen in this country anymore. So this is the first presidential election I'm voting in. And as an anthropologist, I want to bring a comparative perspective to bear, but also one of the principles of method that I want to bear, and this is why I sort of start by saying where I'm coming from, is that it's very hard for me to make objective sense of this political moment by stepping outside of it, right? I think that I feel implicated in this moment, and I'm trying to make sense of it from that position of subjective interpolation into a moment that I'm participating in now in new ways, but also trying to make sense of. And as an outsider looking in and now participating in the American democratic experiment, the thing that still stymies me is the truly exceptional attribute of American democracy, which is the Electoral College. Right? So all the uncertainty, all the anxiety, all the existential stakes that we're feeling about this election in this country and around the world is in a situation in which the national popular vote and the electoral mandate is not in question. Right? Biden has won more votes probably than any other candidate in history, and his margin of victory is going to be greater than Hillary Clinton's was in the popular vote. So I'm interested in this question of what it means about the representativeness of a political structure if a mandate that is as substantial as this leaves us uncertain about the victor for so long. Right? And this isn't just about this election, because we have a situation where in the last 28 years, a Republican has only won the popular vote once, but Republicans have ruled the country for 12 out of the last 28 years. And when I told a friend of mine in Europe that, she was really surprised. And her question was, well, how come Americans haven't risen up in protest about this? And I didn't have an answer. And so in response to your question, what I want to think about is how this election puts into focus the representativeness of American representative democracy in ways that are potentially very fragile and crisis-ridden, but in ways that also potentially create openings for new kinds of transformations. And I want to think about that in comparison to the Indian democratic experiment, which is also at a very fragile moment at this time. But again, as with Mark, it's not through the same trajectories as we've arrived at here.
That's terrific. I mean, we've got in play a whole bunch of good stuff here, right? We've got what I would call, Kaushik, thinking about the Electoral College, something like the burden of institutional inheritances that are distinctly problematic. You pointed it with regard to representativeness. Yeah. We could think about it being problematic in a variety of ways. The state of our democracy, both as it plays here and what is projected abroad. We've got concerns about turnout and partisanship and the divisions and the cleavages that mark our politics and the extent to which there is simply between Democrats and Republicans and others. There's a lot in play. So why don't we start taking pieces of this and dive a little deeper if we could. And Jan, I'm going to start with you, if I could. The question that I have for you is actually the question that you happen to sort of identify, which has to do with turnout. This is a distinctive feature of what's happening right now. We still don't know the outcome, but we do know that we're reaching record levels of turnout. And You hinted at in your answer to the up front about some of the contributing factors, that the ease of voting might be a contributing factor. I wonder if we could take a slightly different inflection of this phenomenon and think about, what does this reveal? The fact that so many people saw fit to come out, what does that reveal about the state of American politics?
Nicely put. I think it reveals a desire to participate, as well as, again, this faith that it will work. I think it reveals the effectiveness of the various voter suppression efforts that the Republican Party has indulged in since 2000, really. You said, why aren't Americans ever out in the streets when an election is over the, just stick with the popular vote. So as you're absolutely right, that twice in 16 years, the person who won the popular vote for president did not assume the office. That's very unusual. It doesn't seem like a democracy. It's thanks to our wonderful creaky old Constitution and its Electoral College. Maybe in 2000 we should have been in the streets. Maybe the kind of decorum of 2000 and the anger, but general faith that, okay, and Al Gore gave the best speech of his life in 2000, and the Republic didn't crack, and we did not have political violence, and no one even spoke about the possibility of political violence in 2000, which was really, when you look back on it now, if there's ever going to be an opportunity for political violence, that maybe ought to have been it, but it wasn't. It was on the table, this time around for a variety of reasons. But I guess, I would show my cards here and say that I don't think that Donald Trump is the most dangerous man in America. I think Mitch McConnell is the most dangerous man in America. And we can make invidious historical comparisons. We could say maybe the most dangerous man since Jefferson Davis, just to throw one out there. But honestly, what the Republican Party has done disgracefully since 2000 in terms of, some of it was luck. They got the census. In 2010, they had the state houses. They molded that to their liking. We've had study after study about the gerrymandering that's gone on. The Supreme Court hasn't helped with voting back, rolling back the Voter Rights Act. Citizens United was a catastrophe for honest elections. So it's not, Mitch hasn't done everything. He's had some close allies, and then just my last grievance against Mitch, which I think is actually a really important one, is what he did to the Supreme Court when he refused to allow Merrick Garland's nomination to go forward. You don't disallow the nominee of a duly elected president, 9 months before an election, from going through. And that was another moment probably we should have been in the streets as well. And that's had huge repercussions. But also, I think for me, it was about the most disheartening thing I'd ever seen in American politics.
Do you want to, if we collect these things, one explanation for the high levels of turnout is the failure in the past to push back in the ways that you're describing. And that, so both as an explanation for why turnout was as high as it was in 2020, and as a kind of characterization of what's happening in our politics, there are these, how to put them, grievances that have accumulated, and that may be part of what's going on.
Yeah, we won't know, who exactly has voted, what the new, populations are, if young people have really come out in the way that people have encouraged them to come out. But it seems clear to me that people wanted to participate in this election, and they thought that voting would make a difference of some sort.
Mark.
One of the things I haven't looked at, but I've become curious as a result of our discussion right here, is what the change in turnout was, what the increase in turnout was in the battleground states versus all the other states. Because what's mostly powered the increase in voter turnout since the 1990s was the concentration on the battleground states and all the resources that went in the battleground states and the way in which the parties put money into mobilizing people in the battleground states. I just have an impression that turnout is probably up across the board, that it's not just in battleground states, it's also in states that are a foregone conclusion, like Illinois and California, New York and Texas. Well, maybe not Texas this year, but it was in a lot of states where there really wasn't any competition to be turning out. Well, that tells you that it's not that people sort of feel like my vote can make a difference, the outcome can hinge on my turning out and people like me turning out, but rather people turning out because they want to express themselves, and to express themselves in particular about the state of our politics. And so where Jane's kind of an optimist on this, I'm more of a pessimist. I sort of see it as motivated by fear in many ways, a fear of what will happen if we have a two-term Trump presidency on one hand, and a fear of what will happen if the Democrats take back over after just a single term on the other.
Liz.
I wanted to add a thought about the form of mobilizing that has been at play during the pandemic. This is a kind of found experiment around a question that has really interested political scientists as to whether face-to-face canvassing versus mailers versus digital. There's a whole literature on this, but I wanted to raise a question from the vantage point of the work on social movements, particularly that of Zeynep Tufekci, who writes in the New York Times on digital mobilizing. And the argument she makes is that if we think of Tahrir Square, Gezi Park in Istanbul, digital mobilizing, things going viral, can be extraordinarily powerful in getting people to the streets, or perhaps to the polls. But it sets up problems in terms of developing the kinds of ties among people who are mobilized and the understanding of an agenda going forward. So I think I'll come down between sort of optimism and pessimism, that the implications of this mobilization will in some ways be reversed engineered, and that what happens in the next year or so will lead people to conclude whether their vote made a difference or whether it didn't. And that's a real danger in terms of political cynicism and disillusionment. And I think that's something that the incoming administration will really have to think about, is creating the facts on the grounds that can sustain an optimistic reading of this year's extraordinary turnout.
Marco.
I just want to offer an alternative perspective on the turnout. Historically, turnout in Philippine elections has been really high, about 70% typically, and it's come to be expected, and that's because there's always so much at stake. There's always a sense that the fate of democracy hangs in the balance. It really speaks to the quality, the tumult of democracy in the Philippines. And for a while, people looked at turnout in the United States, and it was, of course, relatively low compared to the rates in the United States, but they took it as a sign of strong institutions, that the ship, regardless of who was captain, was sailing along and would keep up. And so, one way to interpret high turnout is perhaps a sense of crisis, a sense that it really matters now to turn out. And in the Philippines, there's always been that sense, and politics has been exhausting, utterly exhausting. And that's why when people looked to the United States and they thought of it as boring, in some ways that was a compliment.
They longed for it.
Precisely. And so now that this week has been exhausting, but it's always like this in a way in a democracy that's on the edge. And so one way to think about this turnout is, I know it's wonderful, certainly, but at the same time, what does it say about the state of our politics?
Thank you.
No, and I think building exactly on this, Marco, is this sense of part of what always afforded the belief in the reproduction of our politics, right, albeit with divergent opinions expressed and so on, was that institutions would provide a set of normative guardrails and would prevent it from going off the tracks enough that a tyrant or a demagogue would take over. right? And now I think it's become quite evident that many institutions have been weakened to the point where they're not performing that function. Certainly Congress isn't. And certainly it didn't during the impeachment hearings, right? It's not just that it came to the wrong conclusion, it's that it didn't go through the process. And so I think there is that desperation, right? And I think that's where the exhaustion and the anxiety of this week comes, because the elections were the last shot, right? Like if this doesn't allow for a reproduction of some dearly held political norms, then what do we have to fall back on?
And if I could add, I think this sense that there's something larger at stake than just choosing a liberal or a conservative, we're accustomed to that, but that the democracy hangs in the balance. It hangs in the balance insofar as both there's a sense that institutions and norms have been damaged, and that the inadequacies of these norms and institutions have been revealed.
That's right.
And that, in fact, we should have been worrying in the past in ways that we were not. And that sense that we were secure in our small d democratic footings was folly, or at least exaggerated. There wasn't due cause. Okay, so Liz, can I come back to you? Because you're the next question. You're up next. And so one thing that's happening right now is a sense that the polls are off. I mean, I think the national polls, they look to be pretty good, but we've been off on a number of state polls. And there's lots of discussion and ongoing concern about why that might be, about how do you target effectively likely voters, or likely voters within a state, in a world in which people are using their cell phones or not answering the phones and response rates are 2%. Okay, so there's that. But there's this other sort of more general thing, which is that we've been talking about where the polls are as kind of our purview into politics, to try to get a sense of where are we at. And the polls that we get at the state level seem to have been off. And I'm wondering, what's your sense about, are there undercurrents, are there features of our politics that we've been missing, that we need to bring to the fore, that should be a part of our collective kind of shared conversation about how we understand this moment and our politics more generally? What are we missing?
So let me preface this with a comment and a caveat. The comment is that Will just did a very USC professor-like thing, which is he asked me to answer the question I asked him 2 days ago, because I was truly puzzled.
Yeah, me too.
So
back at you.
You did. I'm not a public opinion scholar. I'll do my best. The caveat is that the sort of empirical premise of the question is one that has been changing rapidly in the discussions in the media today. So precisely the ways and the degree to which the polls have or have not been wrong is still, I think, very much in play. But I do think, as someone who approaches politics more from concerns about mobilization and participation, that there's a basic assumption of public opinion polling that has been brought into question. So our model of voting, really in post-war social science, is you start with attributes of the person. If we know your gender, your race, your occupation, your educational level, then we can predict how you're going to vote, maybe the region you live in. And so you draw a sample of individuals that's properly weighted on the attributes you think that matter, and you generate an estimate from a sample in the hundreds, maybe the thousands, for an entire population. Think about what gets missed there, which are all the sort of meso-level contexts that actually shape not opinion, but doing something about the opinion, right? It's the registered voter to likely voter to actual voter, right? And those are your social networks, your media consumption, your organizational membership. Really smart survey methodologists have tried to work in some of this social context for the act of voting, but the straightforward polls still go from individuals to an estimate of the population and largely jump over all that social organization that generates variations in intensity. And that's what seems to matter right now.
Yeah. We wave our hands at the ground game. We're not quite sure what that is, but as a kind of gesture towards what you're describing, but not engaging in a serious-minded way. Except, I'll note our former colleague Betsy Sinclair wrote an important book that came out several years ago called The Social Citizen, in which she tried to elevate these kinds of concerns as well, and very much as you're.
She's one of those clever methodologists,
she's one of those
very
clever
methodologists.
Yeah. Mark, you've written sort of a seminal book, actually, in this space about mobilization and getting people to come out and to turn out. This bends a little bit towards our prior discussion about turnout. Do you want to weigh in on this?
Well, I'm not so sure. There are also a whole bunch of technical problems that polls have been challenged by lately, and especially that people don't have landlines anymore. So the whole idea of area probability sampling has become much, much harder than it was in the past. There's also been a huge decrease in response rates and cooperation with polls. So that, now it's not unusual with the telephone poll to have single-digit rates of response. And that's very, very different from what it was in the past. So I think the industry, too, is still struggling with some technical problems. So I'm not sure how much of it is that the society's changed in a way that makes it harder to assess what people are likely to do, and how much it is that it's just really hard to get people to tell you the kinds of things that you would need to know in order to predict what they're going to do. So I think there's something of a, with the rise of these new media, and especially with cell phone communications and the internet, I think that has thrown up some really, really difficult methodological problems for all polling organizations. So I'm not sure which one it is, but somewhere between those two probably.
I think one thing that you pointed to that crosses both, though, is the idea that people aren't willing to come forward and say what they think. I mean, that is a technical problem. How do you elicit it? But as a phenomenon, it's worth interrogating as well. Like, why is it that people are, or certain kinds of people are less willing to share their views about certain subjects is itself worth asking questions about.
Another funny aspect of it is that the cost of doing a poll have just plummeted. Right? When you had to do face-to-face and you had to go to people's doorsteps and you had to ask them questions and everything was on paper and you had to then translate it into tallies and the like. There are people who say, I've never known anybody who's responded to a poll. It was kind of an honor to be part of a poll, right? Well, now you just get bombarded all the time with this stuff. And sometimes they're honest to God political polls or honest to God scholarly polls, and a lot of the times they just want to get you on the phone because they want to tell you something. So I think it's also kind of cheapened the experience for people than what it was in the past.
So one thing that, a word that hasn't been said yet, so I'm going to say it, is populism as an emergent force in American politics. And to my mind, populism is one of the reasons why our democracy is on its heels and it's being challenged in profound ways. And populism isn't just an American phenomenon. There's a long history of populism in Latin America. We're observing rising in Europe and in Asia and in South Asia. And I'm wondering if I could turn to you, Marco, just say a little bit about, if not populism per se, I mean, if you want to grab a hold of populism, great, but how are we to make sense of the kind of forces that are working their way through American politics and channeling our democracy? How do we as Americans are kind of stunned and baffled, right? Our mouths are agape, as you put it earlier. How should we think about these in a much broader context?
You're right that populism is, it's described movements in Latin America and Asia for a long time, and different kinds of populists indeed. To be honest with you, I'm a little suspicious of the term, and I think the label might be misleading. And again, from the perspective of the places I study, so particularly the Philippines, but I also have my eye on what's happening with Bolsonaro in Brazil or Modi in India. Let me suggest that at least in those countries, and we can discuss of whether it's true also in the United States. What I think makes more sense, what I think gets at the heart of the matter better than a label like populism, which deflects attention to the leader and to his charismatic qualities, is this idea that liberal democracy is in crisis, that it's no longer the model that it used to be. I think in a lot of these countries, it's a working out of what should the model look like then, a toppling of the old gods and an attempt to kind of erect something new, something maybe more appropriate to the kind of societies people have. And I'm reminded of an op-ed that came out just a few days before our election in the Manila Times. So this is in the Philippines. That I think speaks to this crisis. And so the author of the op-ed, he pointed to Trump's mishandling of the pandemic here in the United States. And he said he saw in it the unraveling of the myth of US democracy. He saw the stripping of illusions, he used those words. And he also took it as a warning of what kind of political system that was and how we should take steps to not emulate it, to not commit the same mistakes. In other words, and this is why this is stunning to me, is because it's a complete reversal of how people used to see the United States. He said that Trump's failures was an argument for supporting the strongman leader Duterte in the Philippines, right? So he looked at Trump and he said, this is a cautionary tale of liberal democracy's intrinsic weaknesses, and that's why we need somebody like the current president, Rodrigo Duterte. And I think these are how people are making sense of things. So they're paying attention for sure, but they're interpreting it in ways that are particular to their context, right? And so they look at Trump and they see weakness, and they look at Duterte and they see strength, and they say, I want that. And to be clear, it's not, people often portray it as the line between democracy and authoritarianism. And I don't think that's how people on the ground are thinking about it. They're thinking about, we want democracy, but we don't want that kind of democracy. Mm-hmm. So really, it's a line that cuts across democracy and maybe separates liberal from illiberal variants. And I think the terms of democracy, there's going to be great contention of that. I think that's the future. I think people are going to be trying to figure out what kind of democracy we want. So I think we're at the beginning of something, not the end.
Mm-hmm. Marco, something that you're doing, which is, I want to underscore, is recognizing not just that there are kind of forces, call them populism or something else, right, that play across national boundaries, but that communities are eyeing one another, nations are eyeing one another, drawing conclusions on the basis of what they see abroad in order to update how they want to remake or re-engage their own politics.
Oh, absolutely true. And so they may not be, be geeking out, as you said, about the, who's leading in Pennsylvania or in Georgia, but they look at what's happening with the pandemic, mm-hmm. and they draw lessons from it. Mm-hmm. And they say, well, Duterte may have killed 20,000 people in a drug war, but he shut the country down. Mm-hmm. Look at what that guy's doing. Mm-hmm. Right, and so
we're at 220,000 and counting.
Well, precisely, and so to be clear, that op-ed I just mentioned, the title of it is "I Hope Trump Wins." Mm-hmm. Right now, clearly, the author does not want Trump to win because he's good for America. Mm-hmm. He wants Trump to win because he thinks Trump gives the lie to the model of American democracy, mm-hmm. and he's good for somebody like Duterte. Mm-hmm. I mean, this to me, this kind of this way of thinking is absolutely is new.
Mm-hmm. Well, I mean, just building on this, I don't have a knowledgeable answer to the populism question, but I also strongly believe that what's happening in America has some distinct attributes relative to what's happening in India, right? Because, of course, the expression of mandate is different in India because it's a parliamentary democracy, and so what majorities mean are different. But it's very, very clear that the Modi government is becoming increasingly authoritarian, especially in its second term, expansion of an internal security apparatus that's targeting its own citizens, suppression of dissent, attacking journalists, lawyers, students. But it's also very clear that Modi has received a mandate twice of a kind that Trump never received, mm-hmm. right? And so there is something here about an illiberal democracy, right. the legitimacy of which comes from the sort of legitimate authority that I have a popular mandate, right? And I think that mm-hmm. difference mm-hmm. is something to think about and try and make sense of.
Mm-hmm. I want to come back to you shortly to build on and ask you more about sort of the health of our democracy. More generally, in a comparative perspective. But Jane, can I put you on the spot?
Sure.
Can we try this? So, and populism is, I mean, I would disagree that populism is just about the single individual. I think there are movements, populist movements, and the ability of a populist leader to tap into the anger and disaffection of a larger population speaks to something larger than just the personal qualities or the rhetorical flair of the guy at the top. But so here comes the putting you on the spot. Is could you say a little bit about how the extent to which populism is taking hold today? Does it differ from trends in the past? This is not our first take.
Well, no,
populism.
it's complicated, and I'm confused about this because the United States did have a genuine populist moment. It had a party called the Populist Party at the end of the 19th century. So that election I mentioned before in 1896 is the high water of American participatory elections until today was the high water of populism too. That was an enormously important election, and populism really kind of receded. But the trouble with populism in America, or one problem with it, is that people who then want to try to explain things like the Ku Klux Klan in the 1920s, which seem to also be populist by some model, end up saying things like reactionary populism in order to differentiate it from what was a liberal producerist populism of the late 19th century. So I mostly just get confused about how to use that word, frankly, in American politics.
But is it safe to say that whatever we're going to call the thing from the 1890s populism, we're going to call a thing that Trump is a populist, and that whatever those means, they're not the same?
No, and the populism of the end of the 19th century did not rely on a demagogue. It didn't. There were people who were like William Jennings Bryan, who were enormously, who were fabulous speakers and were enormously popular and motivated a lot of people. But it didn't. There wasn't a sense that you needed a strong man at the head of populism. That kind of populism. I mean, that was much more a cooperative, on the ground populism than I think what we're talking about now when we talk about illiberal democracies.
Mark.
Jane, I just wanted to bring up Andrew Jackson, though, because that's the other populist moment that I think of. Right. This vast expansion of the U.S. electorate because of the decline or the repeal of property restrictions on voting, the advent of universal white manhood suffrage, and then Jackson was very much a strong man, a general, and certainly seen that way. So. And Trump himself has sometimes drawn parallels between himself and Jackson.
Yes. Yeah. Now you really are putting me on the spot.
Sort it out for us, Jane.
Well, I can't. I mean, I think, Mark, your point about the explosion of universal white manhood suffrage in the Jacksonian era is a really important one because, of course, that's state by state. It's not something Andrew Jackson did, but he was the electoral beneficiary of it and represented this, the West being Mississippi. In those days, Mississippi comes into the Union with an extremely liberal constitution that provides for free white manhood suffrage. So if you're looking, for, now we're back to participatory democracy, whether or not that's an attribute of populism or not, I'm even more confused about because I don't think it's an attribute of the, of the kinds of populism we're talking about over here.
Liz.
One place where I think you can draw a parallel between the 1890s and the present is one definition of populism that's widely used now really focuses on a key relationship between, the pure people, the corrupt elites. And that's central to the producerist vision, right? There are the good people, and then there are bankers, lawyers, and liquor dealers, I believe, are those who are not producers. So that configuration is really consistent, even though 1890s populism is massively different than what we're seeing now in all kinds of ways. But both pose questions about political leadership then, because we're not, an unmodified democracy, but a representative democracy. So there's built in a difference between that leadership group, that elite, and the mass of citizenry whose decisions legitimate authority. That dynamic is the same, even though it plays out in radically different ways.
That's a good point.
During this period, too, this is not about the populism, but the progressivism. It's a recognition that the institutions we've inherited are not up to the task to meet the challenges of their day, which goes to the original point that you had made earlier, Kaushik, about, where does we inherit this electoral college, and it's absurd in lots of ways and profoundly unrepresentative, and it creates all kinds of anxieties and distortions. And you have, over the course of the evening, raised the kind of basic first-level concerns about the health of a democracy, and the health of U.S. democracy is sort of hanging in the balance in this particular moment. And I wonder if, in looking at this election and as it's playing out right now and over the course of the campaign, are there things that you could point to that says, that worries me, where you can draw parallels to India or to other countries that are generative?
So maybe I'll say a couple of things here. I've been thinking a lot with the constitutional law scholar Aziz Rana, who talks about the two faces of American freedom. And drawing upon him, I want to think about the two faces of American democracy that I think were inscribed into the foundational moment of this country, right? And one is a set of extremely aspirational and inspiring ideals of universal rights and franchise that are not just a set of abstract ideals, but are a part of the lived political culture of this country, and that have been expressed in all sorts of, for me, extremely humbling and inspiring ways, through tens of thousands of people, phone banking, text banking, mobilizing, becoming poll workers, election judges, right? We've really seen the expression of a constitution, of one side of a constitutional id that has existed from the get-go, right? But alongside that, I think there was another foundational inscription, which was not just that the founders were, but that they also perhaps implicitly assumed the subject of rights as being the white man of property. In other words, there was also a very exclusionary and exclusive foundational idea, right? And I think that the entire history of American democracy has been an unresolved argument between the sort of aspirational universality of a set of very grand ideals that has been inscribed in a fundamental imagination of freedom of contract and inalienability of property in the image of the white man of property. And we're seeing that play out even now, right? So I'm very interested in, at this moment, therefore, the juxtaposition of two things, right? The first is the sort of Trump discourse of, stop counting votes where I'm behind, keep counting them where I'm ahead, which could be read just as sort of cynical hypocrisy. But I think more profoundly is a very aggressive drawing of the boundary of who we the people are, right? It's not the black voter in Philadelphia who's we the people. And alongside that, I've been very interested over the past month in Republican Senator Mike Lee of Utah saying around the Amy Coney Barrett nomination, we're not a democracy, we're a republic. Right. And therefore setting up the judiciary not just as one of three co-equal branches of government, but the first amongst equals. And so the thing that I want to put on the table here is I think that what we're seeing is an existential crisis for the Republican Party, where in a sense their claim to democratic legitimacy, certainly over the past 20 or 30 years, has been founded on a set of institutional norms and actual institutions, the Electoral College, the Senate, that has baked in a structural advantage for them. And both of these, in fact, are racist institutions. They privilege the white rural vote and disenfranchise everybody else. And now even that's not enough for them to win power, right? So I think that for me, that's both the crisis of democracy, but also the opening for reimagining and having a really honest conversation about what a more representative democracy would look like.
Thank you. In a similar line, Marco, if I could come to you, are there moments or things over the course of the last few months that imagining somebody who once thought that we were a beacon and that what you're characterizing as having always been in tension was in fact resolved, leading to a kind of disillusionment and a sense that maybe that isn't what I thought it was. Are there moments or trends or things over the last few months or even in the last few days that you think are catching notice in the Philippines or elsewhere?
Look, let me start by talking about what's happening now. I want to go back to the first comment that Mark raised about polarization. And so I'm hearing a lot of interpretations of this polarization. And so people are lamenting that the margin is thin, they expected a landslide, and they can't imagine how half the country could support a man like Trump. And that's everywhere. I'm hearing it. I just came from a class where my students were saying, how could people actually vote for that guy? How could half the country vote for that guy? And I agree with Mark. I think what's different, so I want to move the attention away from the fact of polarization to how people are talking about it, how people are interpreting it. And there seems to be a kind of discounting of the other side, as in, they don't know any better. Something's wrong with them. I can't believe they're not like me, right? And so that reminds me of something as an observer, particularly of Philippine democracy and new democracies in the developing world. That move, that gesture is familiar. I mean, these democracies impose formal political equality over, great social inequality. And so it's a reflexive move to say, well, most of the people who can vote don't really know what to do with those votes. And so we should keep it to the people who are actually educated. And they use various vocabularies to this: people who pay taxes, people who are educated, right? And this is how they think of it. It's curious to me to see this gesture creeping into how Americans are thinking about their own democracy, which makes me wonder about the kind of inequalities that divide us in real life, that are shaping how we think about the other as not having the same right to make a political choice as we do, or somehow their political choice, my political choice is greater, is more informed than yours, is better than yours. And so you don't know what you're doing. Like I said, it's familiar in the Philippines because people always say, oh, that guy, he doesn't know, he didn't go to school. It's such a familiar gesture, but to see it here is alarming, frankly.
Thank you. Thank you. Liz.
I wanted to pick up and really reinforce what Kaushik said about we have never been a democracy. We have been a democratic republic or a representative democracy, from the beginning. And that's not a contradiction in the sense of something to be resolved. It's what I've called in some of my recent work, a constitutive contradiction. That's there, right? You've got the real problem of how do you harness popular sovereignty to a system of government that generates inevitably elites with concentrated power. That's built in, and that tension has generated all kinds of conflict. It's generated creative but partial and temporary solutions over and over again, but it never fully resolves. So we're certainly at a moment where the health of our representative democracy is, I think, in question. And that's a first step towards maybe coming up with another episode of real institutional creativity. It's not a guarantee, but it's maybe a first step to starting to have that conversation and recognizing that all of us here on this stage are part of that elite that is represented. And I think we too often forget that in these comments along the line that Marco just mentioned. Yeah.
I think the thing you're pointing to, though, is the possibility that that which is observed to be in tension can be generative, right? That we observe that, in fact, it isn't what I thought. There's also this other piece that can be in the service of, well, the unleashing of new energies and imagination and insight and the creation anew of the institutions that we've inherited.
Well, I would also say that we want to recognize that straightforward, unqualified democracy can be profoundly illiberal. It can lead to Caesarism and all those kinds of things. So there's a reason why these two principles are put together that are in tension with one another. There are admirable things about that, even if every resolution is profoundly flawed in its own way. It's also generative.
Great.
Yeah.
So if I could, we want to take some questions from our audience. And I have a first one, which I'm going to, you guys can grab it. Yeah, we're going to put it out there, and if you want it, grab it. So the first one is going to be, how are we, and we've gestured towards this, how are we to think about the future of the Republican Party in the aftermath of this election? How's this going to play out? And so there it is. It's waiting for you. Who would like it? Okay. Jane, you go first, and then we'll have Mark.
I'll grab it a little bit. There has been no repudiation of Trumpism in the election, which I think was anticipated, or some people hoped that there would not just be a repudiation of Trump, but also of Trumpism, and that seems not to have happened. So I'm not really sure how the Republican Party is going to remake itself. It's not clear that they want to remake themselves. They might have, I think, if the election had been a bit different, but I don't see Mike Lee going anywhere, or Ted Cruz, or any of, what's his name, the guy Matt Gaetz in Florida, leading lights of the Republican Party. Yeah, I'm not sure. I don't think they're going to wake up and say, we have to change our strategy of trying to be ruled by permanent minority, which has been their strategy, I think, since 2000, with voter suppression, and that they want to be the minority party, but ruling. And I don't see anything that's happened today to really change their mind on that.
Mark.
Yeah, I think the Republican Party has a terrible problem. The terrible problem is that the strategy that they've adopted clearly has legs to it, legs that are much stronger than I thought in 2016. Basically Trump has not just ruled as a minority president, but Trump has also ruled as someone who directs his attention only to a minority. Unlike every previous president in our history, he has made no attempt whatsoever to actually broaden his appeal. So the Republican Party has doubled down on a part of the electorate that is not only a minority, but is becoming an increasing minority in this country. And in 2012, there was, I thought, some very sober thinking about that. After Mitt Romney lost, there was some really sober and important thinking about what the Republican Party needed to do to reposition itself for a future where non-whites, who are a rising proportion, and in many states already a majority of the electorate, will become even a larger share of the electorate, and a future where young people today, the youngest cohort in our society today, are as overwhelmingly in the camp of the Democratic Party as the oldest members of our society are in the Republican Party, even more so. So there's this enormous tidal wave that is going to hit them, and they can't do a thing about it because there's something called death, and that brings an end to
it awaits us all.
To many citizens' political involvement. So I think they have
in Chicago.
I think they have a terrible problem, and the terrible problem is that they're pinned down to a position that they need to get away from, but they have just become even more strongly pinned down to that position than they were even 8 years ago.
Okay, the next question comes to us from David Ennis, and I'm not going to hold this one out. I'm going to assign it because of one word that's in it. It says, rural areas almost exclusively supported Trump and urban areas almost exclusively supported Biden. What is the anthropology of this? That's you. God, you've got to now represent all of anthropology and make sense of this urban-rural divide. What's the significance of it?
Gosh, I can't make sense of that. I was hoping you would turn to Liz and ask her.
No, but were anthropology not in this, you would have been in the clear.
But one thing I can put on the table is a comparative question, right? Which is that for me, something that I've been wrestling with, and this is not going to answer the question in the terms that it's posed, but hopefully it will do something, right? Is that it's been constantly interesting to me that even while Modi in India presents himself as a populist, some of his strongest bases of support come from the urban elite, right? Whereas the urban elite, by and large, and not just the urban elite, but urban voters, by and large, repudiate Trump across the board, including now increasingly in red states, right? It used to be the case that cities in red states would still be reddish or red, maybe red. That's not the case anymore. You go to pretty much any city in any state in the country, and it skews democratic. That's not the case in India. Yeah. And I don't understand the sociology of that fully, but I observe it.
Yeah. Thank you. Well, I just wanted to agree. I mean, that's certainly true in the Philippines too, that a lot of Duterte support is in urban areas among the middle class. And so this is very different from the US dynamic. I mean, but it certainly suggests to me that the kind of social environments along the urban-rural divide are not only changing, but they're constitutive. They shape how we think, and maybe they determine the kind of conversations we have with different people. And so, to go back to Liz's point, it's not just about who we are in terms of a list of attributes. It's a question of who we interact with, who we talk to, the kind of circles of socialization that shape us. And to an extent, it seems like they're increasingly segregated along, in this case, an urban-rural divide.
Mark.
Yes, I grew up on a farm in a part of the country where the population density was a little less than what's in this room right now per square mile. So, and I very much remember the resentment that the people that I grew up with felt toward people in cities. And I think that in some sense that goes way back. The urban-rural division in U.S. politics is actually not that new. It's, I think, strengthened, but it goes back. It used to be less obvious back when the South was Democratic and where you had rural Democrats and rural Republicans from the North. It kind of blunted that kind of division. The other thing that's out there, though, in the rural-urban dichotomy is what happens and how do people in the suburbs think of themselves. And so we have tended to think about the suburbs as being quite Republican. And one thing that seems to be happening is that some of those suburbs have decided that maybe that's not the right place for them anymore. That they are coming to think that their values or their interest or whatever it is are in fact more aligned with people in urban areas. Even in urban areas where they left those cities to live in the suburbs because they didn't quite feel at home. So that's a sign too that there may be some things happening even along that divide that could be quite significant for our politics.
Next question. Althea Guzman asks about the implications of the legal battles that appear to be immediately before us, the implications of them for the transfer of power. And they obviously they could have, depending upon how the courts respond to them, have implications for who the next president is. There is that. But we could, if I can read even more into the question than Althea may have meant, what these battles mean for the capacity of the next person to govern, the kind of reverberations that these kinds of challenges have for the health of our democracy, and what stands before whoever that might be who occupies the White House going forward. Who? Liz?
Let me venture just 2 points. I think regardless of how the challenges play out, the next president will face a substantial proportion of the citizenry that profoundly questions, maybe to put it mildly, the legitimacy of the administration. And I think that will be a durable feature of the next administration that the court battles now will simply amplify. I think the more consequential effect will be whether there is one of these challenges or more than one of these challenges that plays out in a way that strengthens the case for a serious institutional reform of the judiciary system. One of the striking things in the last month or so has been the strength of that conversation for a reimagining of the courts. And that's actually where I think the stakes of these legal challenges are going to be.
So you've done it again, right? You've reestablish your credentials as the person who sits between the optimist and the pessimist by pointing to both the effects that these court cases will have in terms of making the country less governable and suggesting that it might productively lead to institutional reform of the judiciary that we need. There you go.
Yeah.
All right.
That's what I do.
Well done.
There's structure and there's a place for action.
Yes. Okay, so we've got another question from Philip. I'm going to do my best here. Rosomando, that is related to both your answer and the previous question. He asks, democracy requires compromise, and we seem to be unable to find our way to compromise. And so how, not just over the next few months, years, how do we think over the next decades, how we're going to, he says, survive? Question.
Well, it's difficult. I don't think that the Republican Party has an incentive to compromise right now, even if there are Republicans who want to compromise. I think Mark was saying that they are in a difficult position. They know that we have a pandemic. There are things that need to be done. We need another stimulus package. But their chief electorate disdains compromise.
So what does that mean for us?
I'm not sure.
Forward?
I'm not sure what that means for us. The anthropologist has an answer.
Yeah.
No, but I have, well, two thoughts here, right? And the first is, I think this is one of the ways in which McConnell has been so extremely damaging, but also before that, Newt Gingrich, because it's not just the fact of compromise, one needs forums for compromise, right? Forums whose business it is to be the space where compromise can be reached. And those forums have been both destroyed and weaponized by McConnell and by Gingrich before him. They've been turned into partisan forums, and now they're busy turning the judiciary into one such forum. But the other thought that I had is that Democrats also have a role to play, a responsibility to bear here, because the way in which Democrats have used the idea of compromise, Clinton and after, is to always submit to the Republican agenda halfway. And that, I think, has generated an enormous amount of anger amongst the progressive base who feel not spoken for by the Democratic Party.
I'm going to go right to the next. I'm going to go right to the next question. You can circle back because it's right on this point. Yeah, Lauren Tapper asks, where does the far left come into play here? Are they gaining influence over the Democratic Party and moving the party further and further left? We've pointed to a number of kind of disturbing trends on the right. Should, if you are a good moderate, or you believe in compromise, or you believe in the possibilities of a representation of a broad, diverse country, are there reasons to worry about the influence that the far left is having on our politics? Now, Lauren, I've read way more into your question than you may have intended, but there it is. Who wants?
I'll jump in a little bit.
Great.
I think that the left wing in the Democratic Party has shown that they can compromise by behaving very well during this election. Joe Biden was not their champion. They, may or may not have all the policy positions that they want to have in the platform and that they want to see happen. So I don't see the left wing as a threat to anything. I would rather see them as partners in building solutions. And I think that their particular issues, climate change, really chief among them. They will take the lead on that, and the lead that they will take will probably be the necessary lead, just because of the disinclination on the part, not so much of the Democrats, but of just so great a portion of our population to not think about this existential threat. And here's where the young voters come into, because this is their number one issue, is climate change.
Mark?
Yeah, I think in terms of, how do we get back to a more consensual politics, I do think that there's reason for hope that there'll be a new consensus that can arise as these rising generations in politics, younger people who are coming of age, and new citizens, and just a much more diverse electorate becomes kind of the norm in U.S. politics, that it can kind of reestablish a consensus. The right moved that consensus considerably to the right over the course of the 1960s into the 1980s, and slowly things have been moving back in the other direction, but it will reach a tipping point. And the question is, are there fractures within that rising majority, I would say. It's interesting, Kevin Phillips in the 1960s was writing books called The New Republican Majority, and since the 90s he's been writing books called The New Democratic Majority, and he's exactly right about that. The majority, the place where the majority is changing, and the question is whether that majority will be established around a set of issues where there might be disagreements, but those disagreements are not existential in the way that they've become these days. So I think our hope is the people who are replacing us.
Back to death.
Yes.
As the driver of progress and
Absolutely.
possibility.
Right.
I think the place I will look to see an answer to this is what comes out of these policy-specific task force that have been set up, specifically with some people from the Biden camp and some from the Sanders camp. And there's been a very interesting effort to policy domain by policy domain, try to come up with concrete proposals that might represent, as far as we can go for some of those people, and a viable first step for others. And that's a really interesting practical move to get beyond waving membership cards in different factions, to sort of articulating plans that can mobilize not only legislators, but sort of constituents of these different factions within the Democratic Party. It's an interesting move. I don't think we've seen enough that's come out of it, but if that's successful, it's actually a really positive move for building this sort of new working agreement.
Mm-hmm. So just two thoughts here. The first is I don't think there is a far left in the Democratic Party. I think that there is a constituency that's demanding the reinstitution of a new ideal of a welfare state. But I don't think that's far left, right? So for me, to reiterate what Jane said, I think that the real cleavage here is that we're at a generational moment. So it's, I think, generational rather than ideological, right? Bernie Sanders is speaking to young people. He's not speaking to leftist people. And climate change really is the critical issue here. But I think the second wrinkle here for me, Warren is a really interesting figure in this, because more than Bernie, she's the institutional geek. And so what she's really creative at is imagining a space of creating institutional revitalization for the expression of popular sentiment, including generationally. If that succeeds, then you have the building of a new consensus. If that fails, you're going to have a generation that's seriously disillusioned with the Democratic Party and probably with representative democracies.
Okay, we've got a question about the Electoral College from Nicholas Tsoulos. I hope I got that right. It's a question not about the merits of the Electoral College, it's a question about how might we get rid of it. And I don't think that Nicholas is asking for like a civics lesson on how do you amend the Constitution, but rather, what would it take to, I mean, you put it out from word go. Here's a strange kind of relic of the Constitution that we continue to live with today. What would it take for our country to meet this? Mark.
Let me give a flip answer. A Republican losing or winning the popular vote and losing in the Electoral College. This is an institution that has only ever benefited Republicans.
Yep.
But if it then benefits Democrats, or is perceived to benefit Democrats, then does the opposition just flip?
I don't think so.
You think that Democrats would get behind and move forward?
Yeah.
So that's what needs to happen.
We can all get behind that.
But
anyone else on this?
I think the serious implications for this question, and others might weigh in on it, is that it's broader than just the Electoral College, right? And so I think that the stakes of this kind of question are really on the table now for court reform and judicial reform. As how do we, are we thinking about this in ways that, I mean, this is Biden's reluctance with court packing, right? I mean, are we thinking of responding to this in a way that is or seems partisan? Or can we devise creative solutions that solve the problem in institutionally imaginative ways that are not immediately seen to be benefiting one side?
And if I could say, not just devise solutions, there is that, but there also is, how do we carve out a space in our politics where they're taken seriously, where we engage them in a deep way, wherein we expect our elected officials to take action on them, and where they fail to do so, we punish them. I mean, we're a long way from that being a feature of our politics, just as we all sit up here and say, yeah, it's there. We do stand before a crisis of democracy, and yet how you get your traction to actually set to work on fixing it is profoundly difficult, in part because of polarization and and a Republican Party that now benefits from this particular one. In part, it's because we're about to move into a period of divided government, wherein the ability of the next president to do much of anything is going to be restricted. I mean, that's our best guess. I mean, who knows? Something may have happened. We've all turned off our phones. Something may have happened in the last hour, and our audience may know things that we don't.
Probably.
Right? But the ability to move forward productively and set to work on rebuilding these institutions is really hard.
I think here it's helpful to make another contrast with 1890s populism, where the activity of being part of that movement included driving your wagon into a meeting and listening to 4 or 5 hours of lectures about monetary systems. Populists had lending libraries, so there was a mobilization that was deeply immersed in the details of institutional arrangements, and we don't have that. Now we've gotten bits of it in debates over healthcare reform, sort of bits of it in other places, but that kind of deep commitment to understanding institutions, it is not easy for academics to understand what on earth the sub-treasury system was and how it would work. But they knew. They had invested the time to understand what a complex institutional invention would look like. And we need, I think, to take that lack on our part really seriously.
Yeah, I've just been thinking about a lot of the comments in the last few minutes, and it's I don't know if I'm that optimistic, to be honest. I'm hearing a lot of calling to civic virtue, hearkening back to times when things were more consensual, and hoping for a return to these things. But if we take the fact of polarization seriously and we say that that's not going to go away, I can't see these things working. And it's certainly true, I think, of my kids, and they're certainly interested in climate change, and they're more sympathetic with candidates. Even I have a hard time getting around. But I can imagine that in other households, in other places, their kids are thinking about things in a very different way as well. And they're as much the new generation as my kids are. And so if this map is reflective of the future and it's not just an aberration, I don't know if we can rely on the old models. I don't know if we can go back and kind of reconstruct some kind of the days when democracy worked here, let's try to do it again. I think the issue might be, how do we learn to live with dissensus rather than seek to re-piece together some kind of consensus that may or may not have existed? And I think that requires thinking about politics in a radically different way. I don't know what these are. I wish I could be more specific, but you know, the kind of the calls to virtue, I don't know.
But the calls to virtue, I mean, our founders were skeptical of. I mean, they built a system of government that didn't rest upon the virtue of any individual. It was meant to guard against no? I mean, so in some sense, the tensions that we're describing go all the way back, and the presupposition of human nature is that it's profoundly flawed and venal and ignorant.
So perhaps there's a different kind of virtue at stake. Maybe this Aristotelian notion of civic virtue, we need to rethink in a different way. Maybe it means I profoundly disagree with you. I don't even understand why you see things that way, but I respect your right to say it. What about that? I mean,
can we work off of that?
That's certainly baked into our democracy as well.
Yeah. So let's do this. You've just said, here's something to hope for. And if we could we have to wrap it up. So if each of you could say, here's one thing that I would hope for in the weeks, months ahead, something that might be generative. You got to say something. We'll make you last, Mark, because as the pessimist on the panel, right? We're good.
Just building on what Marco said, I think not consensus creativity. And one site where Biden really has the power and the ability to institute that, even in divided government, is in the choice of his cabinet. Mm-hmm. Because this isn't about a centrist cabinet or a progressive cabinet. He has such extraordinary talent at his disposal to choose from, of people who've been thinking about institutional issues and who have creative solutions for them. I think if he gets his cabinet right, in generating a public discourse, not just in taking decisions, in generating a new public discourse, there's real potential there.
Jane?
Oh, I wasn't optimistic yet.
You're not? Okay, we'll come back. Should we come back? Liz?
I want to go back to an earlier point about the work of an administration in reverse engineering or retroactively engineering a sense that your vote mattered. And I think that is actually one of the key challenges. And that can happen in quite specific and limited ways. We're not going to get climate change solved all at once, but trying to say, here is something concrete that we did and it is meaningful or beneficial for you. Figuring out those points that can anchor a sense of government as responsive might be a first step to reconstructing a government that could actually be responsive in a substantial way.
Mark?
Well, I think one of the things that the last 4 years has taught us is how important it is to have leaders who believe in democratic values and who exercise self-constraint or self-restraint. And so I think a positive move for Joe Biden, if he does in fact become president, as I would anticipate, would be to go out of his way to make sure that his Justice Department is not pursuing crimes that were committed by Donald Trump. There'll be plenty of that happening at the state level, and that's where it belongs. But you'll remember in 2008 when Barack Obama came in, there was a very strong faction within the Democratic Party who basically wanted to put George W. Bush on trial and who wanted to extract revenge on the Bush administration, on Bush himself. And I think that Obama wisely resisted that, and that it was a mark of Obama's character that he resisted that. And so I think taking those small steps to kind of reestablish those norms, exercising self-restraint, and showing that there is a different way to behave in office than has been the norm over the last 4 years is one of the things we really need to reestablish those norms.
Jane, final word.
final word.
Make it good.
Oh gosh, I'm terrified about the Supreme Court. When you said my optimism would be, please, John Roberts, have lunch with Elena Kagan often, because I don't know what's going to happen with this court, and it has nothing to do really for me with abortion. It has to do with whether or not the entire administrative state will be dismantled, because 4 of the conservatives, basically, I think Elena Kagan said, believe that government is unconstitutional. So I am frankly terrified and hope for the best when it comes to the Supreme Court.
Thanks for a terrific conversation and an airing of lots of big themes and challenges that we face. We need to turn turn it over to Dean Woodward.
Thank you. Thanks, Will, and thanks all of you panelists for a really robust and thought-provoking conversation. Appreciate it. I'd also like to thank our viewing audience for being with us and being part of our extended community this evening. The final thing I want to do is remind all of you that there are 2 more Harper Lectures coming up soon. On November 18th, which is a Wednesday, there's a Harper Lecture entitled COVID and Beyond, Understanding Vaccine Adjuvants and Innate Immune Responses, that features Aaron Esser-Khan, who's an associate professor in molecular engineering. And then on Thursday, December 3rd, there's a Harper Lecture entitled Closing the Gap, Reducing Youth Health Disparities, that features Melissa Gilliam, Ellen H. Block Professor of Health Justice and Vice Provost for Academic Leadership Advancement and Diversity. So with that, one final thank you to our panelists and to all of you. Good night, and we'll see you soon.